Imagine opening an old map of Africa from the 1970s. You scan across the continent: Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, and then you notice a country that no longer exists: Rhodesia. Today, you won't find it on any modern map. Its flag is gone, its government disappeared, and even its name was erased from the world. Yet, decades after its fall, Rhodesia remains one of the most controversial countries ever created. To some, it was a prosperous nation known for its farms, industries, and economic growth. To others, it was a symbol of colonialism, racial inequality, and minority rule. Its leaders defied the British Empire. Its soldiers fought a brutal war against insurgent forces, and its future became the center of an international political struggle. For years, Rhodesia stood alone against growing pressure from both inside and outside its borders. But in the end, the country disappeared forever. How did Rhodesia come into existence? Why did it challenge Britain? And how did it eventually become the nation we know today as Zimbabwe? This is the story of the rise and fall of Rhodesia. Long before Rhodesia existed, the land was already home to powerful kingdoms, thriving communities, and ancient trade networks. For centuries, the region was inhabited by African peoples who built societies, cultivated the land, and established connections with neighboring territories. Among the most remarkable of these civilizations was Great Zimbabwe. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe became one of Africa's greatest medieval cities. Its massive stone walls, some standing more than 10 meters high, were constructed without mortar and remain one of the continent's most impressive architectural achievements. At its peak, Great Zimbabwe controlled important trade routes across southern Africa. Gold mined from the surrounding regions flowed through its markets. Ivory, copper, and other valuable goods were exchanged with merchants from distant lands. Through trade networks that stretched to the Indian Ocean coast, the kingdom connected southern Africa to a much larger world. The wealth and influence of Great Zimbabwe helped shape the region for generations. Although the kingdom eventually declined, its legacy survived. Its stone ruins continued to stand as a reminder of a powerful African civilization long before European colonization. But during the 19th century, a dramatic new era began. Across Africa, European powers were expanding their empires at an unprecedented pace. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal competed for territory, resources, and influence. Historians would later call this period the Scramble for Africa. By the late 1800s, much of the continent was being divided between European empires. Southern Africa soon became one of the most important frontiers in this race for control. And among the men seeking to expand British influence in the region, one figure stood above all others. His name was Cecil Rhodes, and his ambition would change the destiny of the land forever. Few individuals left a greater mark on southern Africa than Cecil Rhodes. Born in England in 1853, Rhodes arrived in southern Africa as a young man seeking opportunity. What he found was a region rich in natural resources, especially diamonds and gold. Through a combination of business skill, political influence, and relentless ambition, Rhodes built one of the largest fortunes in the British Empire. He became the founder of the De Beers Diamond Company and one of the most powerful men in southern Africa. But wealth alone was not enough. Rhodes dreamed of something much bigger. He believed the British Empire should dominate vast portions of Africa. His vision was so ambitious that he imagined a continuous chain of British-controlled territory stretching from Cape Town in South Africa all the way to Cairo in Egypt. To achieve this dream, Rhodes needed land. Lots of it. Using his British South Africa Company, he negotiated treaties, secured concessions, and expanded British influence deep into the African interior. Many of these agreements were controversial. Some local rulers believed they were granting limited rights. Others later argued they had been deceived about the true intentions of the company. Regardless of how they were obtained, these agreements gave Rhodes and his company enormous power. By the late 19th century, British settlers were moving into territories north of the Limpopo River. Roads were built, settlements expanded, and British authority gradually replaced local control. As the territory grew under company administration, it became increasingly associated with the man behind its expansion. Eventually, the land would be given a new name, Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes himself. For supporters, he was a visionary builder of empire. For critics, he represented colonial expansion and the seizure of African land. But regardless of perspective, one fact is undeniable. Without Cecil Rhodes, Rhodesia would never have existed, and the consequences of his ambitions would shape the region for generations to come. As more European settlers arrived in Rhodesia, the balance of power began to change dramatically. The settlers brought new farms, businesses, railways, and administrative systems. Cities expanded, infrastructure improved, and the economy grew. But this development came at a cost. Large areas of fertile land were increasingly controlled by a relatively small settler population. Meanwhile, the African majority found itself pushed onto less productive land and excluded from many political decisions. Over time, a system emerged in which political and economic power became concentrated in the hands of the white minority. This system was defended by its supporters as necessary for stability and economic development. Critics, however, argued that it denied basic political rights to the majority of the population. As the decades passed, these tensions continued to grow. By the middle of the 20th century, Rhodesia had become one of the most developed territories in Africa. Its farms were productive, its industries were expanding, and its economy appeared strong. Yet beneath this prosperity lay a growing conflict over who should govern the country. As nationalist movements spread across Africa, calls for majority rule became louder. Across the continent, European colonies were moving toward independence. New African nations were emerging almost every year. But in Rhodesia, the future remained uncertain. The white minority government feared that rapid political change could lead to instability. African nationalist leaders argued that independence without majority rule was unacceptable. Both sides believed they were fighting for the future of the country, and neither was willing to back down. The stage was now set for a political confrontation that would change Rhodesia forever. By the 1950s and early 1960s, the political future of Rhodesia was becoming increasingly uncertain. Across Africa, European colonies were gaining independence. Ghana became independent in 1957. Nigeria followed in 1960. Dozens of new African nations soon emerged. The winds of change were sweeping across the continent. But many white settlers in Rhodesia feared what would happen if majority rule arrived too quickly. They looked at political instability in some newly independent countries and worried that Rhodesia could face a similar future. As a result, many settlers became determined to maintain political control. Among the leaders who shared this belief was a former fighter pilot named Ian Smith. Smith believed Rhodesia should remain under white-led government and resist outside pressure. To him and his supporters, they were defending stability, economic growth, and their way of life. To their opponents, they were preventing the African majority from exercising basic democratic rights. The divide grew deeper with every passing year. By the early 1960s, compromise was becoming increasingly difficult. Nationalist movements demanded majority rule. The settler government refused. Both sides believed history was on their side. Neither side was prepared to surrender. The collision course had begun, and soon, Rhodesia would take a step that shocked the entire world. On November 11, 1965, Rhodesia made a decision that would change its history forever. The government of Ian Smith issued a unilateral declaration of independence, commonly known as UDI. In simple terms, Rhodesia declared independence from Britain without British approval. The announcement stunned the world. Never before had a British colony attempted such a move under these circumstances. For Ian Smith and his supporters, UDI was necessary. They argued that Britain was pushing Rhodesia toward majority rule too quickly. They believed they were protecting the country's stability and future. But Britain saw things very differently. The British government immediately rejected the declaration. To London, Rhodesia remained a colony. The declaration was considered illegal. Around the world, governments condemned the move. The United Nations became involved. Economic sanctions were imposed. Diplomatic pressure increased. Rhodesia suddenly found itself isolated from much of the international community. Yet despite the pressure, the government refused to back down. Ian Smith became famous for a statement that symbolized his determination. He declared that majority rule would not come to Rhodesia for 1,000 years. It was a bold claim, but history would prove otherwise. As sanctions tightened and political tensions grew, a far more dangerous challenge was beginning to emerge. a war that would ultimately determine the fate of Rhodesia itself. Following the unilateral declaration of independence, Rhodesia entered one of the most difficult periods in its history. Britain refused to recognize the government. The United Nations imposed sanctions. Many countries cut economic ties. Diplomatically, Rhodesia was becoming increasingly isolated. Yet the country did not collapse. Despite sanctions, farms continued producing crops. Industries adapted. Trade networks found alternative routes. The government worked hard to keep the economy functioning. To supporters of Rhodesia, this resilience became a source of pride. They argued that the country had survived enormous international pressure and remained stable despite attempts to isolate it. But beneath the surface, serious problems were growing. Sanctions increased economic pressure. International support remained limited. And most importantly, opposition inside Rhodesia was becoming stronger. African nationalist movements continued organizing and recruiting supporters. Many believed peaceful political change was no longer possible. If majority rule could not be achieved through negotiation, they argued, it would have to be achieved through force. As the 1970s began, Rhodesia found itself facing a new challenge. Not economic pressure, not diplomatic isolation, but armed conflict. The struggle for the future of Rhodesia was about to enter a far more violent phase. A war that would leave deep scars across the country and ultimately determine its fate. By the early 1970s, Rhodesia was fighting a growing insurgency. The conflict would become known as the Rhodesian Bush War. It was a brutal and complex struggle involving government forces, nationalist guerrilla movements, neighboring countries, and international powers. On one side stood the Rhodesian government and its security forces. On the other were nationalist organizations seeking majority rule and independence. The two largest movements were ZANU and ZAPU. Both wanted an end to minority rule, but they differed in leadership, strategy, and political vision. As the conflict intensified, guerrilla fighters launched attacks in rural areas. Government forces responded with military operations designed to eliminate insurgent networks. The war spread across the countryside. Villages became battlegrounds. Families found themselves caught between opposing forces. Fear and uncertainty became part of everyday life. Meanwhile, the conflict increasingly attracted international attention. Neighboring countries provided support to nationalist groups. The Cold War added another layer of complexity. Global powers viewed the conflict through the lens of ideology, influence, and strategic interests. What had begun as a political dispute was now becoming a full-scale war. Despite possessing one of Africa's most capable military forces, Rhodesia faced a difficult reality. The war showed no sign of ending. The insurgency continued growing. International pressure continued increasing. And every year the cost of the conflict became harder to sustain. By the late 1970s, it was becoming clear that Rhodesia could not continue on its current path forever. Something would have to change. The question was no longer whether change would come. The question was what that change would look like. As the war intensified, pressure mounted from every direction. The government faced military challenges. The economy struggled under years of sanctions and conflict. International support remained limited. Even some of Rhodesia's traditional allies began encouraging negotiations. Behind closed doors, political leaders searched for a way forward. The conflict had already lasted for years. Thousands of lives had been affected, and many feared the violence would only continue escalating. Eventually, efforts were made to reach a political settlement. Negotiations took place between the Rhodesian government, Britain, and nationalist leaders. The discussions were difficult. The stakes were enormous. The future of an entire country hung in the balance. In 1979, a breakthrough finally emerged. The Lancaster House Agreement created a framework for ending the conflict and establishing internationally recognized independence. It was a historic moment. After years of war, sanctions, and political confrontation, a path toward a new future had been created. But that future would require something unprecedented. Rhodesia itself would cease to exist. A new nation was about to be born, and with it would come a new name, Zimbabwe. In 1980, the world witnessed the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. After years of war, political negotiations, and international pressure, Rhodesia officially ceased to exist. In its place stood a new nation, Zimbabwe. For millions of Black Africans, independence represented a historic victory. After decades of colonial rule and years of conflict, majority rule had finally arrived. Across the country, celebrations erupted. Flags were raised. Crowds gathered in the streets. For many, it felt like the dawn of a new era. The new government was led by Robert Mugabe, a former nationalist leader who had played a major role in the struggle against minority rule. At first, there was hope. Hope that Zimbabwe could move beyond the divisions of the past. Hope that former enemies could build a shared future. Hope that peace and prosperity would finally replace years of conflict. Leaders from around the world attended the independence celebrations. The moment was seen as a major turning point not only for Zimbabwe, but for Africa as a whole. A country that had once stood isolated from much of the international community was now welcomed onto the world stage. The nation known as Rhodesia had vanished. Zimbabwe had taken its place. But while one chapter had ended, another was only beginning. The early years of Zimbabwe were filled with optimism. Schools expanded, healthcare improved, and many believed the country was moving toward a brighter future. But as time passed, new challenges emerged. Political tensions continued. Economic problems began to grow. Critics accused the government of suppressing opposition and concentrating power. Land reform became one of the most controversial issues in the country. Supporters argued that land ownership needed to be corrected after decades of colonial inequality. Critics argued that the process was often chaotic and damaging to agricultural production. As the years went by, Zimbabwe faced economic difficulties, inflation, and political instability. International criticism increased. Many of the hopes that had accompanied independence became more complicated than people had imagined. Meanwhile, debates about Rhodesia continued. Some remembered it as a period of economic stability. Others remembered it as a system that denied political rights to the majority population. Even today, discussions about Rhodesia often generate strong opinions. The country's history remains deeply controversial. Its supporters and critics often tell very different stories about the same events. Yet regardless of perspective, one fact remains unchanged. Rhodesia is gone. Zimbabwe remains. And the decisions made during those turbulent decades continue to shape the country today. The story of Rhodesia is not simply the story of a country that disappeared. It is a story about power, identity, colonialism, independence, and the difficult choices nations face during times of change. For some, Rhodesia represents a lost nation. For others, its disappearance marked the end of an unjust system. The truth is far more complex than simple slogans or political arguments. History rarely offers easy answers, and few stories demonstrate that better than the rise and fall of Rhodesia. Today, the name survives only in history books, old maps, and debates about the past. But its legacy continues to influence conversations about politics, race, national identity, and the future of Southern Africa. A country appeared, a country fought for survival, and a country disappeared. Yet its story still echoes across generations. Because sometimes the nations that vanish from the map leave behind the deepest marks on history. And this was one of them. Thank you for watching Chrono Secrets. Until next time, keep exploring the forgotten nations, lost empires, and hidden stories that shaped our world.